At the very pinnacle of the golden age of silent movies stood two men, each of whom could be proclaimed the king of comedy. What they had in common was the ability to move their audience to uproarious laughter and even a few tears, putting them far ahead of other slapstick clowns of the time. But they and their comedy styles were very different. Even today, critics and adoring fans argue over who was the greater comic genius, making Charles Chaplin and Buster Keaton two of the greatest Hollywood rivals. Charles Chaplin was born into abject poverty in London in 1889. He and his older brother Sidney were often separated from their mentally unstable mother and alcoholic father. Both parents tried without success to eke out a meager living in the English music halls. 5,000 miles away and 6 years later in 1895, Joseph Francis Keaton Jr. was born in a tiny Kansas town where his parents were touring in a small-time medicine show. At a very early age, young Keaton joined his parents' rough-and-tumble act. Magician and escape artist Harry Houdini nicknamed him Buster because of the acrobatic skills he developed by being tossed around and even off the stage by his father. Thanks to Buster's talents, the Keatons rose from the lowest rung of show business to a respected place in vaudeville. His strength and sense of timing were so amazing that people thought he had to be a midget. Chaplin also began to earn his living at an early age. When he was about 7, he was a clog dancer in a group called the 8 Lancashire Lads. Later, he was part of an act called Casey's Court Circus. He also appeared as an actor on the London stage. In his teens, he joined the Fred Carno Music Hall troupe with his brother. Another member was Arthur Stanley Jefferson, later known as Stan Laurel of Laurel and Hardy fame. It was with the Carno troupe that Chaplin came to America in 1912 to find his future. Keaton continued to work in the family act until he was 21. His father's bad drinking problem began affecting his timing and reliability, so Buster decided to go out on his own in 1917. By that time, Chaplin was already a worldwide sensation. In 1914, Chaplin had been signed to appear in Mack Sennett movie comedies at Keystone, the studio known for its knockabout slapstick. Its comedy stable already included the Keystone Cops, Pretty Mabel Normand, and rotund Fatty Arbuckle. Although not really comfortable with the Keystone slapstick style, Chaplin did his best to fit in with the studio's other comics. In his first one-reel comedy short, Making a Living, he played a conniving English dandy. In his next picture, Kid Auto Races at Venice, Charlie began to experiment with elements of his immortal Little Tramp character. For costuming, he borrowed a jacket that was too small, plus shoes and pants that were too big. A bowler hat, mustache, and cane completed the image of a poor man aspiring to middle-class respectability, making him both comic and slightly tragic. Many traditional English music hall elements can be found in The Little Tramp, but Chaplin slowly imbued him special personal qualities that lifted him out of the usual one-dimensional comic character. Chaplin also appeared in one-reelers with Normand and Arbuckle. and he more than held his own as a knockabout comic. He seemed to favor kicking his opponents in the rear end and was often accused of being too vulgar. Chaplin also seemed to like dressing up as a woman, something he did in several of his movies. His feature debut came in 1914, playing a comic villain with Mabel Normand and Marie Dressler in Tilly's Punctured Romance. In many of his early pictures, he was only an ordinary slapstick comic like the others at Keystone. But by 1915, Chaplin had become one of the most popular comedians in the movies. In Between Showers, he and Ford Sterling, another Keystone star, fight over an umbrella and then battle for the right to escort a young lady over a puddle. But he was also beginning to display the ballet-like grace and variety of facial expressions that made him unique among comics of his time. His desire to gain more control over his films finally paid off. He began directing. From then on, he was to insist on total control as he began to shape his immortal comedy creation. At first, the little tramp wasn't much more than a funny costume, but his own compassion gave the character the humanity that endeared him to audiences. Many were themselves poor immigrants who readily identified with the little guy's struggles in an uncaring world. After about 35 one-reelers for Senate, more than half of which he had directed himself, he made a deal with the SNA studio for $1,250 a week. It was his first, but by no means last, shrewd business deal. Among his pictures for SNA was The Tramp, in which he finally perfected his unique screen persona. Although he rescues a pretty girl from robbers and even gets shot for his trouble, he realizes she already has a sweetheart. At the end, he walks down the road alone. It is a scene that was to become one of his trademarks. Edna Purviance was his leading lady, both on and off the screen. She had been a secretary when he first discovered her and put her into movies, remaining his leading lady until the early 1920s. Chaplin often became romantically involved with his leading ladies. Occasionally, he even married them. His first brief marriage had been to 16-year-old Mildred Harris. He was always attracted to very young women, something that was to cause him a lot of trouble later on. In another picture at SNA, Burlesque on Carmen, Chaplin plays the swaggering Darn Hosiery. This was Chaplin's only direct parody of another movie, poking fun at Cecil B. DeMille's version of Carmen. Carmen is played by Purviance, who by this time was part of Charlie's life off the screen too. Charlie Chaplin himself had a role model in the Frenchman Max Linder, perhaps the first really successful screen comedian. From about 1910, Linder had played the character of a man about town. If Chaplin did not actually imitate Linder, he certainly benefited from watching the great comedic actor on the screen. Chaplin didn't always play a tramp. In 1 a.m., Chaplin is a wealthy man returning home from a drinking binge. An ordinary house becomes an obstacle course for the tipsy tippler. In this movie, Chaplin repeats his drunk act that he played on the Carno Troupe tour. During the SNA period, his popular two-reelers included Shanghai. Charlie is hired to get men for a ship's crew and winds up shanghaied himself. In Work, he is a paper hanger named Izzy A. Wake, who manages to create mayhem with a bucket of paste. In 1916, with his popularity soaring, Chaplin moved over to the Mutual Studios. There, he earned $10,000 a week and received a $150,000 signing bonus, much like today's sports stars, for an astounding total of $670,000 for just 1 year. For this, he was to star in 12 films a year. Because of his ever more deliberate pace, they took longer and were completed in 1917. Many of them are still considered comic gems. Among them is The Rink, in which he is a waiter who claims to be Sir Cecil Seltzer. He displays his remarkable athletic grace on the skating rink, where he has gone to impress Edna. The pawn shop shows his slapstick skills are undiminished. His encounter with an alarm clock is especially hilarious. There was plenty of the famous Chaplin pathos in The Vagabond. In it, Charlie is an itinerant violinist who saves poor girl Edna from villainous gypsies. Even after it is discovered she is a missing heiress of a wealthy family, she chooses to stay with him. Chaplin had a stock company of players to support him in his movies. During the Mutual period, this included roly-poly Henry Bergman and the tall, hefty, and fearsome Eric Kemble, who would replace the equally formidable Max Swain as the comic villain. (1917) was also the year that Buster Keaton came to New York to appear in a Broadway musical. Instead, he began his totally unexpected rise to fame after a chance encounter with Fatty Arbuckle. Movie mogul Joe Schenck had signed Arbuckle to write, direct, and star in a series of two-reel comedies, and Arbuckle hired Keaton to be part of his stock company of supporting players. Fatty was very generous in helping other comedians, and practically the same day they met, Keaton made his very first picture appearance. He supported Arbuckle in a number of comedy shorts, including Oh, Doctor. Buster found that he was instantly fascinated by how everything worked. He even dismantled a movie camera. When Fatty's company relocated to California in late 1917, Buster went with him. They remained together until Keaton was drafted into the Army. During the First World War, Buster went overseas with the American Expeditionary Force, a grim experience for the comic who had been on the verge of movie success. While Keaton served in France, Chaplin, still a British subject, remained safely at home.
Over there, send the word over there, that the Yanks are coming, the drums coming everywhere.
Although he got some criticism for not joining up, he did his bit for the war effort by selling war bonds at mass rallies. He also played a private in the three-reel comedy Shoulder Arms, which managed to make the terrible war seem funny. Rejoining Arbuckle upon returning in 1919, Keaton soon formed his own production company with Joe Schenck. In one of the few instances where the Keaton and Chaplin paths crossed, the studio that Chaplin had owned a few years earlier now became the Buster Keaton Studio. Unfortunately, the naive comedian was a poor businessman. But for the next few years, he found increasing success, starting with a series of comedy shorts. His two-reeler, The High Sign, made in 1920, highlighted Buster's fascination with mechanics. In it, he rigs up a house with booby traps to protect his girl and her father from crooks. Soon he became known as the Great Stone Face for never smiling on camera. He had noticed he got more laughs if he didn't laugh, so he maintained the same expression throughout. It wasn't that his characters didn't feel emotion, his face just never seemed to change expression. It was left to the audience to read into it whatever they wanted, but if his face didn't show his feelings, his body language often did. On the other hand, Chaplin was sometimes accused of being too sentimental and of practically demanding tears from his audience. In 1920, Keaton made his first feature, The Saphead, about a rich but incompetent boob trying to prove his worth on Wall Street. Based on a Broadway play that had starred Douglas Fairbanks, it was not very typical of Keaton's later features. Over the next 2 years, he made such films as The Playhouse, in which he played all the characters in the audience and on the stage, including old and young women and a performing monkey. Its advanced use of multiple exposures is brilliant camera work for that time and is considered his most innovative two-reel film. In Cops, arguably his most famous short today, Buster takes a wrong turn and winds up in the middle of a police parade. When an anarchist throws a bomb at the police, it lands in Buster's wagon. Then all hell breaks loose. Every cop in town chases him, and he uses all his acrobatic skill to escape. The chase had been a part of movie comedy from the very beginning, and police were stock comic characters since the inception of the Keystone Cops a decade earlier. But Buster pushed the envelope with a snowballing situation. Hundreds of extras were dressed up as cops for this frantic chase scene of nightmarish proportions. Spurned by the one he loves, he gives himself up and is the victim of instant justice. The last shot is of the hero's tombstone with his pork pie hat resting on it. A real Keaton touch. In The Electric House, he plays a man hired to rewire a house. Again, he displays his lifelong fascination with gadgetry. He creates such marvels as an electric stairway, an electric folding bed, and an electric food server. However, a rival sabotages his work, creating total havoc. Buster's heroes were constantly frustrated by the world. The Boat, one of his personal favorites, is definitely a comedy of frustration. After building his boat, the Damfino, in his basement, he finally manages to get it outside, only to cause his whole house to collapse. Every imaginable catastrophe strikes the boat. Showcased in nearly all of Keaton's pictures was the athletic ability that he had refined in his family's act. Unlike Chaplin's more balletic style, Keaton favored out-and-out pratfalls. He often was seriously hurt doing stunts, and once he even broke his neck on one occasion without realizing it. Keaton had his own production company, but Chaplin went him one better. In 1919, he had combined with such Hollywood legends as Mary Pickford, Douglas Fairbanks, and director D.W. Griffith to establish United Artists, which became one of the major studios. When his mutual contract ended, Chaplin had signed with First National to make 8 two-reelers for more than $1 million. Unlike the early days when he turned out a movie every week or so, He was now a very deliberate filmmaker who barely produced 2 pictures a year. A Day's Pleasure is one of the rare movies in which Charlie is shown with a wife and family. His day of fun turns out to be less than funny, except to the audience. In The Pilgrim, he's an escaped convict who poses as a clergyman. Called on to preach a sermon, he makes a big hit with his improvised story of David and Goliath. This was his last film of less than feature length, and the last in which Edna Purviance played his leading lady. Although he was already one of the most recognized people in the world, Chaplin added even greater laurels with the 1921 feature The Kid, co-starring 7-year-old Jackie Coogan. Charlie finds an orphan and raises him. When well-meaning meddlers try to take the boy away, Charlie fights back. Putting to use his great skill with both comedy and pathos, Chaplin had his audience alternately laughing and crying.
The Kid. You won't stop laughing until you cry.
This was the first feature both written and directed by Chaplin, and it sealed his status as one of the most revered screen actors in the world.
But perhaps his greatest film, one which is on almost everyone's list of the 10 best pictures of all time, is A Woman of Paris.
In 1923, he directed the sophisticated drama A Woman of Paris, his first film for United Artists. It starred Purviance, whom he had hoped to make a major star on her own. Chaplin played only a cameo role in it as a gigolo. Although it proved very influential with other directors, including Ernst Lubitsch, A Woman of Paris was not very successful in its own time. It also marked Edna's last American screen appearance. Largely unseen for the next 50 years, it was rediscovered to great acclaim by modern audiences. That same year, Keaton began his real feature career with The Three Ages, the adventures of an earnest young man in prehistoric times, in ancient Rome, and in modern day. One segment demonstrated Buster's love of baseball. Though it was a full-length movie, it was really more like 3 shorts edited together. That way, Keaton could have released them separately if it had not been a success. But he need not have worried. It was a smash hit. In his next picture, the historical comedy drama Our Hospitality, he displays his maturing style. Although other directors were sometimes credited, Buster really helmed his own movies, and this one shows his ability to create his own vision on the screen. Our Hospitality's accurate and loving recreation of Kentucky in the 1830s is typical of Keaton's painstaking care in making his period movies look authentic. Its plot about a feud reflects the major theme of all of Keaton's movies. An ordinary man is thrust into extraordinary circumstances and has to overcome them. Buster usually did just that. The scene where he rescues his lady love from a raging river was not only exciting, it almost cost Keaton his life. Its leading lady is his wife, Natalie Talmadge, sister of movie stars Norma and Constance Talmadge. Natalie would be the mother of Keaton's 2 sons, but their marriage would not be a happy one. While Chaplin made only 2 feature films in the 1920s after The Kid, Keaton came out with about 2 movies a year. A popular Keaton comedy was Sherlock Jr., in which his trick camera work is renowned, especially the scene where he becomes a part of the movie that he is projecting. He also recreated some of the tricks he had learned in vaudeville. The blurring between movie reality and fantasy was a device that Woody Allen borrowed for The Purple Rose of Cairo. In 1925, Keaton made the farce 7 Chances, featuring a plot that has been copied by everybody from the Three Stooges in The Brideless Groom to the recent film The Bachelor. A man has only a day to get married, otherwise he will lose a large inheritance. After being spurned by every woman he proposes to, news leaks out about the inheritance. He ends up pursued by every female in town. The chase scene tops the one in Cops. When initial previews of the film indicated the ending was slow, Keaton filmed an additional chase scene, with Buster trying to avoid a landslide of boulders he accidentally dislodged. This scene brought down the house. While all these films are considered classics, Keaton's acknowledged masterpiece is the Civil War comedy The General. When Union spies steal a train, it's up to Buster, a Confederate engineer, to rescue his beloved locomotive, and as an afterthought, save his girlfriend, who got abducted at the same time. With its extended locomotive chase between the Union soldiers and the pursuing Buster, the result proved both funny and thrilling. Its almost photographic reconstruction of the South in the 1860s is still amazing. The General was not very well received by either critics or audiences when released in 1927. Because of the expense involved in making the film, it lost money. Its failure was a major cause of Keaton's production company being disbanded the next year. In 1925, Charlie Chaplin made what most consider his masterpiece, The Gold Rush. Its story of the little tramp trying to strike it rich in Alaska during the gold rush of 1898 was richly funny, thrilling, and poignant. His second wife, Leda Gray, was to be his leading lady, but she became pregnant with the first of his sons, Charles Chaplin Jr. To replace his child bride in the Gold Rush, Chaplin picked the near-unknown Georgia Hale to play the dance hall girl who rejects him, but finally realizes she loves him. Hale also loved the real Charlie, but they never married. Among the picture's many classic scenes is the Dance of the Rolls, where he entertains the dance hall girls. Former Keystone sidekick Mac Swain reunited with Charlie in the role of the crazed prospector. In one memorable scene, Charlie and Swain are snowbound in a cabin and near starvation. Charlie serves up a cooked boot as if it were a meal fit for a king. After they finish dining on their shoes, Swain hallucinates that Charlie is a chicken and decides that he looks good enough to eat. It was another 3 years before the release of Chaplin's next film. The Circus, made in 1928, is now considered one of his minor works. However, Chaplin received his first Academy Award for versatility and genius in writing, acting, directing, and producing The Circus. Chaplin was still at the top. After the commercial failure of The General, Buster Keaton began his slide, slowly at first, and then ever faster into obscurity. His films had begun losing money, partly because his perfectionism increased costs. Steamboat Bill Jr., made in 1928, would be his last independent feature. This film contained one of his most amazing stunts, one that could have actually cost him his life if it had not worked. During a windstorm, the front of a house falls on him. Luckily, he is standing just where an open window is. In part, his lack of business sense had brought him down. Joe Schenck, his brother-in-law, dissolved the production company and signed Keaton up with MGM. Both Chaplin and Harold Lloyd earnestly advised him not to do it, but after the box office failures of his movies, Buster wanted the financial security of being linked with a major studio. He later said it was the worst decision of his life. Keaton's first MGM film was The Cameraman. Although it showed no decline from his other films, it proved the final movie Buster Keaton had complete artistic control. From then on, he had little say in the production of his movies. The studio executives at MGM decided what was best for Buster. Sound was now revolutionizing the film industry, creating panic among the top stars. Could they talk?
I have thought of getting a broadening experience, but a person in my position can't very well afford to indulge in whims.
While Buster's voice didn't really hurt his career, it didn't help either. In his next few films, he was teamed with other MGM players and was only one of the crowd. In place of his formerly unique character, he played what we would now call a nerd. His characters were almost always named Elmer.
I forgot to purchase one.
Because he was independent of the studio system, Chaplin did something that startled the world. He refused to make a talkie, and in 1931 released another silent, City Lights. Although cynics predicted disaster, the picture was a smash hit. The final scene of the little tramp confronting his now-cured sweetheart is one of the most famous in cinema history. While Chaplin could choose his projects and didn't make another film for 5 years, Keaton had no such freedom.
Say, here's one you can't miss. In Scotland, the movie theaters of Bill and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is a double feature.
You know, Dr. Jekyll had double features.
MGM teamed him in 3 pictures with irrepressible Jimmy Durante, whose noisy style was totally opposite his own quiet one. The Schnozola stole every picture they made together. Keaton rightly thought MGM was grooming Durante for stardom at his expense. Depressed at his turn of fortune, Buster began drinking heavily and battling with the bosses at MGM. In 1933, he was finally fired for his unreliability. He lost everything, including the mansion that had been used as a background in his 1931 film, Parlor, Bedroom, and Bath. He also lost his wife, Natalie, who divorced him and took his sons away. As the final blow, she changed their last names from Keaton to Talmadge. He rarely saw his children again. In a drunken stupor, Keaton married May Scribbins, a woman he barely knew. The result of their brief union was that she took the little money he had left. He was off the screen from 1937 to 1939, but managed to find work as a gag writer. At MGM, where he had once made $3,000 a week, he was now being paid a paltry $200. Gags he wrote for Red Skelton Pictures bear the Keaton touch. but they mark a career sinking out of sight. Although talkies had dominated the cinema for many years by 1936, Chaplin was still determined to remain silent, and he had the clout to do it. Modern Times opened to acclaim. It was a clever satire on the machine age. The scene in which Charlie fights the assembly line is another of his most brilliant comic inventions. The film contained sound, but no real spoken dialogue. His left-wing political views were reflected in the anti-capitalist slant of Modern Times, something that would come back to haunt him later. As he did in all his talkies, he directed, wrote the screenplay, and even composed the music. His co-star was Paulette Goddard, who also became his third wife, although details of their marriage, like what year they tied the knot, was not revealed by the secretive Chaplin. Goddard also co-starred in Chaplin's long-awaited first talkie. The Great Dictator finally came out in 1940. Much of its humor is still rooted in silent comedy. In it, he played a double role, the Jewish barber, which was the swan song of The Little Tramp, and the raving dictator Adenoid Heinkel of Tomania. Any resemblance to the raving dictator Adolf Hitler was strictly intended. The strutting Benito Mussolini was called Napoloni in the film. Its political overtones and the preachiness of its ending made the film controversial, but it hilariously satirized the German tyrant and other fascist bigwigs. For The Great Dictator, Chaplin received 2 Oscar nominations for Best Actor and Best Writer of an Original Story. While Chaplin entered the 1940s as a major star, Keaton was trying to scrape a living playing small character parts in movies like The Villain Still Pursued Her, a spoof of old-time melodramas. Another of his roles in the early 1940s was in Lil Abner, the film version of the Al Cap cartoon. It was considered to be embarrassingly unfunny. Buster played a character called Lonesome Polecat. Keaton managed to get a few small character roles during the rest of the decade, though there were some years he was not seen on the screen at all. Despite his hard times, Keaton did manage to find lasting wedded bliss when he married Eleanor Norris, a young movie dancer. In 1943, at the age of 53, Chaplin also married again, this time to Una O'Neill, the 18-year-old daughter of playwright Eugene O'Neill. This also proved a lasting marriage, one which bore 8 children. With the advent of the Cold War, Chaplin's left-wing politics were criticized as being anti-American. In a few short years, he had gone from being the most beloved figure in America to being one of the most disliked. He had never taken American citizenship. When he left the country in 1952, he was barred from returning. He settled in Switzerland. Chaplin always denied he was a communist. He called himself an internationalist and a citizen of the world. As if to support him against the attacks on his character and patriotism, the French promptly awarded him their Legion of Honor.
What is there to fight for? Everything! Life itself, isn't that enough? To be lived, suffered, enjoyed. What is there to fight for? Life is a beautiful, magnificent thing, even to a jellyfish.
In 1952, the sentimental Limelight was released, in which he recreated the British music halls of his youth. The young Claire Bloom was his leading lady.
There's your cue. Get on that stage.
Oh, it's falling. It's my legs. I'm paralyzed.
Get on that stage there.
Meanwhile, the long-forgotten Buster Keaton began his climb back from obscurity. Ironically, it may have been Chaplin who gave him the boost. He had cast Buster in Limelight. Although it was a small part, and Chaplin cut many of Keaton's funnier bits, it put him in the spotlight again.
The Buster Keaton Show!
For the remaining 15 years of his life, Keaton experienced a renaissance. He had a television show on which he recreated some of his classic routines. He also made popular commercials. A film biography, The Buster Keaton Story, starring Donald O'Connor, came out in 1957.
Buster, things are different.
How much did you make out of the boat? A couple of million? You think I like crawling to you for some two-bit part? I'm still Buster Keaton, do you understand? You can take your studio and shove it through a microphone.
Although the picture was not very good, the fee for the story rights gave Buster financial security for the remainder of his life. In 1959, as a tribute to his genius, he was awarded a special Oscar. In the movies, Buster continued to play small parts in several films. One of them was Beach Blanket Bingo. He was barely seen in It's a Mad, 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 Mad World. It featured almost every movie comedian except Chaplin. In the late 1950s, Chaplin released the British-made A King in New York, which satirized the American political climate of the day. His young son, Michael, had a part in it.
Don't you remember me?
I should say I do, the most obnoxious brat I've ever met.
That's too bad. But I don't feel that way about you.
Although it contained some funny moments, it was a distinct come-down from his great films and was barely screened in the United States.
At the Savoy Hotel in London, the movie's most famous clown makes an announcement. Charlie Chaplin is returning to motion pictures to direct Sophia Loren in a romantic comedy in the Chaplin manner. There are 250 newsmen and photographers on hand to hear the first details of the project that brings Mr. Chaplin back to movies after a 14-year absence.
In 1967, as the furor over his politics died down, Chaplin directed A Countess from Hong Kong in England. It starred Marlon Brando and Sophia Loren.
Teamed with the most beautiful woman in the world.
Chaplin had a brief cameo in it, marking both his last acting and directorial appearances. Actress Tippi Hedren, who had a small part in the picture, recalls Chaplin's method as a director.
The way he directed was that he would act out all the different parts. He'd become Sophia's character. He'd become Marlon's character, mine. Marlon didn't appreciate this too much. Every actor in Hollywood, all over the world, wanted to be in Charlie's last movie. They said they would do it for, as a walk-on. They would do anything just to be in the movie.
While Chaplin remained a non-person in the United States, Buster was regaining his popularity. One of Buster's last films was A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum in 1966, directed by Keaton fan Richard Lester. In it, the aged comedian proved he could still make a pratfall. When Buster Keaton died in 1966 at the age of 70, he was mourned by a whole new generation of fans who were rediscovering the nearly forgotten genius. After ignoring Chaplin for 20 years, Hollywood wanted to make amends. Although he had swore he would never again set foot in the country that had made him rich and then rejected him, he returned to thunderous ovations. In 1972, Chaplin was awarded his second special Oscar for the incalculable effect he had in making motion pictures the art form of this century.
Thank you for the honor of inviting me here.
To accompany his status as film royalty, he was knighted by Queen Elizabeth in 1975. He was Sir Charles for the remaining years of his life. The once idolized Charles Spencer Chaplin died in 1977 at the age of 88, again recognized, like Keaton, as one of the greatest comedians in cinema history. He was not quite out of the headlines yet. In a farcical twist he might have appreciated, his body was stolen for ransom, but was soon recovered. Charlie also had a film made about his life. It was Chaplin, for which the star Robert Downey Jr. was himself nominated for an Oscar.
Did you expect ever to play Charlie Chaplin?
I guess I must have. It seems like there was a lot of synchronistic things about it. In a house that was supposedly his, and people telling me, boy, you should play Chaplin, and just stuff like that. You go, wow. You don't remember it until you look back and you say, oh, yeah, you know.
Out of the many comedians to gain fame on the silent screen, few of them are even remembered today, much less honored. Chaplin and Keaton were much more than just slapstick comics like most of their contemporaries. Their genius has stood the test of time. The Little Tramp and The Great Stoneface. They were alike in a number of ways. Both were the sons of struggling show business families. Both had to work and perform on stage at an early age. Both rose to superstardom in Hollywood, and both would suffer fall from public grace and abandonment by their legions of fans. And both would be restored to favor and great acclaim in their later years. While in some ways they had much in common, in other ways, Chaplin and Keaton were completely different. Even today, critics and adoring fans argue over who was the greater comic genius. Although rivals at the box office, Keaton and Chaplin never bore animosity toward each other, respecting each other's talents and ingenuity. Ultimately, it is a rivalry in which everyone wins, for their films remain comedy classics to be enjoyed by all. Rather, it is modern-day fans and critics that argue over who was the more inventive, who was funnier, and who deserves to be proclaimed king of comedy. The vain, egotistical Chaplin, constantly hailed as a genius in his own time and loving every minute of it, naturally would have considered the crown his. The soft-spoken Keaton, who let others take credit for directing even when he controlled every shot of his best films, would not have claimed the throne. But today, legions of adoring fans and critics award it to him nonetheless. And if they were at all rivals, it is in the contest to see who could get the most laughs. It is a feud that goes on long after their deaths, with each new generation of admirers watching their immortal films. Charles Chaplin and Buster Keaton, dueling kings of comedy and Hollywood's funniest rivals.